I think, I mean, we get the whole idea. So I probably, we as a Korean had to think about how to privatize the remedies for inequality. So, minimum wage or the redistribution, in-kind transfer or basic income. I guess, I mean, that have to be done specifically under the initial condition of Korea, labor market condition, social security and the welfare system level, something like that. That is something we at the Korean have to think more about it. Okay, thank you for your very insightful and very heated discussions. But let's move on to the second topic, which is a very related one. Let's talk more about the job and the work. As you may know, the Korean labor market is very highly segmented. So segmentation between large and small companies and segmentation between regular and non-regular workers. As Professor Hartz already mentioned, we have a serious youth employment issue, especially for college graduate. So Professor Hartz, do you believe that the Korea needs some fundamental labor market reform to resolve these difficulties?
Ich glaube, dass wir das Wertvollste, was wir haben, ist unsere Jugend. Und diese Jugend zu unterstützen und zu entwickeln, ist eigentlich die vornehmste Aufgabe von der Regierung, der Gesellschaft und den Unternehmen. Deshalb sollte man sofort das Thema aufgreifen, wie man den Jugendlichen helfen kann. Heute ist es möglich, eine Talentdiagnostik für jeden Einzelnen zu entwickeln, der die Grundlage ist für eine Perspektive. Jeder Mensch hat Talente und Sie können über die Talente feststellen, für was jemand geeignet ist, auch welche Hobbys er hat. Dazu gehört ein Persönlichkeitsporträt, um festzustellen, welches seiner Interessen sind. Und diese Talentdiagnostik könnte man in einem Coaching-Prozess organisieren. Damit ist es möglich, zielgenau festzustellen, für welchen Job sich der junge Mann oder die junge Frau eignet und besonders interessiert. Und das könnte man dann organisieren. Dieser Coaching-Prozess könnte man verbinden mit einem Trainee-Verfahren, mit einer Trainee-Zeit für den Einzelnen, sodass der oder die Jugendliche während dieser Trainee-Zeit bewusst die Wahl eingeräumt bekommt, ja, das ist für mich jetzt das Richtige aufgrund meiner Talentdiagnostik, oder aber es gibt doch etwas anderes noch, sodass das nicht ein Negativum ist, etwas abzubrechen, sondern im Prozess der Entwicklung würden wir einbauen eine Trainee-Zeit. Die Trainee-Zeit dauert so lange, sie muss ja auch finanziert werden und danach ist dann die endgültige Entscheidung fällig. Und wenn die Unternehmen entscheiden dürfen und wieder jemand zurückgeben dürfen, ohne dass das anrüchig ist, weil es im System so begründet ist, dann bekommen sie dieses Problem gelöst.
Okay, thank you. I still have doubt that whether the training program that Professor Hartz just mentioned will be enough for Korea. What do you think, Professor Stiglitz?
No, I don't think it's enough, and I guess I would begin. I think it's important, and I think the kinds of commitments that Mr. Hartz talked about are really very important, that he talked about in his speech. But to me, one of the real issues here is aggregate demand. You know, in the United States, we've had groups that have had high unemployment, like African Americans and youth. And what you notice is that when you get the overall unemployment rate down, when you increase aggregate demand, those are the groups that benefit, are among the groups that benefit the most. And so that when there is enough demand for labor, employers figure out how to get the other groups into the labor force. So it seems to me that the policies of trying to increase demand seem to me an important ingredient. There's no serious inflationary pressure that should hold you back. Your fiscal position is actually relatively strong. And so it seems to me that programs of increasing aggregate demand, some of the spending could go on to thinking about how you redesign education to match the skills in the labor market that are needed. Some of it to strengthen the opportunity for education. You know, the structure of the education system here requires a lot of private spending to pass the exams, and trying to reduce the cost, or put another way, to increase universal access to education on a fair basis would seem to be a good way of stimulating the economy.
Okay, the Professor Hartz mentioned the active labor market policy, and Professor Stiglitz mentioned the importance of aggregate demand. Professor Deaton and Professor Parijs, do you like to add something else to this?
I know that when we talked about this before, one of the things you worry about is increasing the minimum wage when there are these very large number of unemployed people already, and who are working in small firms and where their employment may be precarious. I think there's been quite a lot of rethinking about that in the US, and it may make some things here. I mean, if you go back 20 years, I think everybody thought that if you raised the minimum wage for people at the bottom of the income distribution, like fast food workers or so on, it would have large effects on causing them to be more likely to be unemployed. I think the gentleman on my left once actually wrote a textbook in which he even said that, and then found himself in the uncomfortable position of recommending an increase in the minimum wage when he was part of the Clinton administration. Is that correct? Yeah. But I mean, I think we're sort of wondering about rewriting the textbooks and thinking about, even in these low-wage occupations, there may be quite a lot of monopsony operating because it's hard for people to move from one job to another, and employers can take advantages of that. There's also the question I don't understand, I just put it out as a question, is why these people are so unattractive to the big firms. I mean, and what are the big firms doing? What's their part in this?
Just two footnotes. One is that, of course, I have no objection whatever at the sort of market sort of policy, labor market policy, which Peter was describing, so that whether you have a structure that wants to push people into a job or not, you want the labor market to function well, so that people's skills, people's willingness to work corresponds, enables them then to find the demand for these jobs. I've always found that just as a firm that works well, a manager that works well is one that finds for each of his workers something that that person likes to do and does well, and the two things go together usually, and at the same time is useful for the organization. I think that's also what a labor market should do at the level of a society, but in my view, without obliging people to accept any job that is regarded as suitable for them by some authority. On minimum wage, in my vision or future vision of a good society, a sort of unconditional basic income is more important than a minimum wage. In part because of what I said earlier, that I want people to be able to prize themselves into jobs that are interesting in themselves. I realize that, for example, some of the NGOs or non-profits I know, if there were a minimum wage, they would be obliged to reduce the number of people they employ. And in jobs where people are really motivated by the content of the job more than by the income they derive from it. And so I want this to be possible. Of course, it can be possible in all sorts of ways. Even with a minimum wage, you can then have people working far more hours than they should, simply because they find the job interesting in themselves. But what matters is really to empower the people so that they can make the choice between what is a lousy job and what is a fantastic job that corresponds to their
Professor,
calling.
Yeah, can I just follow up on that empowering, because one of the things that's happened in the United States is the disempowering of workers through the breaking down of unions, through all kinds of arrangements of like non-compete clauses, arbitration clauses, a whole set and policies that have weakened unions and weakened the bargaining position of workers. So one of the things I think that is very important is to take policies, and there are a whole set of policies that can lead to stronger unions, stronger collective action among workers that will empower them, and that might result in different wages in different sectors of the economy, but would overall lead to a decrease in the inequality among workers, and even redress some of the imbalances between workers and corporations. One of the sources of the problem, again, talking about the United States, is that the CEOs have been taking out so much money, not only the CEOs, but the management. Their unions have not been able to act as the check on this corporate power within the boardroom. And the result of it is that investment is not what it should be, especially given the profits. And this low level of investment is also related to the high concentration of market power, because that means that the incentive for investment is down because marginal returns are lower if you produce more. The result of this is that investment relative to what it should be given the profit levels is very low. And with low investment, there's both low demand and, in the long run, low creation of jobs. And it's a real anomaly when you look at the statistics, until you realize that some of the same forces that are giving rise to inequality are exactly these forces of market power, which are slowing growth, including growth in jobs.
But isn't there one important distinction to make
Responsibly.
that is especially relevant for Korea? Isn't there trade union and trade union? In the sense, aren't there some trade unions concentrated in some sectors that in fact defend the interests of well-protected workers with good jobs, with leaving most of the working population unprotected? That certainly happens in some countries. Or if you look at the situation in France at the moment, there were some public sector workers, especially in the railways, who had a particular privileged status in terms of pensions, in terms of wages, but could hold the whole country to ransom in this case. So trade unions can also be the defenders of privileges in some cases.
They're rent seekers too, but they're rent seekers in a different direction in the income distribution.
Yeah, and the answer is not to weaken the unions. The answer is, in some sense, to develop better senses of systems of social protection for all of the society. The reason that there's such a fight in France about the losing of some of their labor legislation is about social protection. And they know in the world that they live, if they lose their jobs, it may be impossible to get another job, and this social protection is very weak. So the answer, the reason that there is this kind of hesitancy to accept change is that society has left these people unprotected. And in a way, it's the same argument that you're putting forward, which is if you give people a guaranteed income, they will have stronger bargaining power. And the problem right now is there's no backup. There's no social protection, which leaves them totally unprotected without unions that fight very strongly for them.
Okay, professors?
Das Problem können wir lösen, indem wir die Mitbestimmung durch die Arbeitnehmer in den Betrieben einsetzen und erweitern. Die Mitarbeiter kennen sehr gut ihre Betriebe. Und wenn sie mitbestimmen dürfen, welche Investitionen geschehen müssen, dann wissen sie sehr gut, was für das Unternehmen richtig ist. Und deshalb ist die Mitbestimmung, die zum Beispiel in Deutschland sehr erfolgreich ist, wir haben Branchen mit 60-90% Gewerkschaftsvertretung und diese Mitbestimmung hilft dann mit, das Unternehmen zu führen und die Entwicklung der Mitbestimmung der Allgemeinen ist die wertschöpfende Mitbestimmung, weil dann die Mitarbeiter kennen die Investitionspläne und können dann mit darüber diskutieren. Sie verlangen dann auch die Investitionen. Es geht ja um ihr Unternehmen und die Lohnfrage kann man sehr gut über eine Ergebnisbeteiligung, kann man die sehr gerecht gestalten, hat das Unternehmen gute Ergebnisse und sie sind ja heute transparent. Durch die Digitalisierung, das Controlling kann heute ein Großunternehmen die Ergebnisse nicht mehr verhindern oder verschweigen. Es gibt nur die Regel, ein Unternehmen mit guten Bilanzen, dessen Bilanzen sind noch besser. Ein Unternehmen mit schlechten Bilanzen, dessen Bilanzen sind noch schlechter. Aber über die wertschöpfende Mitbestimmung, das ist die nächste Stufe der Mitarbeiterbeteiligung, kriegen wir die Entwicklung und das Marktwachstum kriegen wir hin, weil das wollen die Belegschaften auch. Und gerade mit der Digitalisierung, wo in Zukunft jeder Mitarbeiter diesen Informationswert bekommt und auch diese starke Stellung und auch diese Bedeutung, auch wenn das Unternehmen weniger Mitarbeiter hat, dann hat er eine solche Informationsmacht, die man konstruktiv in der Mitbestimmung einsetzen kann.
Yes, I think, it boils down to this. The critical issue is who is the rule maker of the market. So, as Professor Stiglitz mentioned, in America, the economic power gave rise to political power, which result in rewriting the rule in favor of the rich. In Korea, we have economic power called 재벌. So 재벌 were makers in terms of Professor Deaton. During the economic development of Korea since 1960s up to 1990s probably, but 재벌 now turned into the takers after 재벌's entered industrialization. 재벌 became the gatekeeper in Korea, as worried by the progress movement in early 20th century in United States. Professor Deaton, if you were given an opportunity to reform Korean 재벌, what do you like to do?
Well, as usual, I back into the U.S. and say, well, we have large corporations in the U.S. What would I do in the U.S. to make them? One way is to cut some of the links that lead from successful makers into politics. So in the U.S., for example, the big problem I don't think is so much directly money in politics. It's just that you can't even stand to be a candidate for Congress unless you have deep pockets behind you. So it's not like a bribery model. It's the fact that campaigns cost so much money that there's, in some constituencies apart, but in many places, there's no point at all in running for Congress or for the Senate unless you have deep pockets backing you. So when you actually talk, and I've dared to do this to some of the members of the Senate or the Congress and accuse them of being corrupt, but you then run away very quickly, because, and they're not, and they protest. Obviously there are people who are corrupt sometimes, but there are very few cases where politicians are actually taking money in exchange for policy prescriptions. It's that the politicians are selected from a segment of the population that actually approves of this corporate power. So in the US, to break that link, one way to do that is to change the financing in a radical sort of way. So I don't know enough about the details of how it works in Korea to do the same thing. But the problem is a general one, you know. I mean, many of us, when Steve Jobs died, people were weeping in the streets because they had the great maker, the inventor, and so on, who'd made all these toys that people they loved. But as several people have said, if Steve Jobs were alive today, he'd be in jail. You know, because the first thing he did when he's very successful is start putting anti-competitive practices into the labor market and trying to control the wages of engineers and so on. So this is something that's always going to happen. It's in human nature that when they make it, they start thinking about protecting their position. And you have to cut those links so that it's not so easy to use that success and turn it into blocking the next generation or to controlling the politicians.
Yeah, so let me pick up on two things that Angus said. The first is that there are a number of reforms in our political process that would take money out. We've been, in the United States, putting money in. We have this famous decision called Citizens United where corporations were allowed to give unlimited money on the notion that they were individuals with the right to give. One of the reforms that some countries have is requiring people to vote or effectively providing incentives to vote because it's a public good, and one of the costs of campaigning is getting people out to vote. Free airway, reducing, one of the main spending is on TV and radio. The public own the TV, the airwaves, and the cable connection. So that could be a requirement, and that would lower the cost. So think about how the broader agenda of getting money out of politics, I think, is a key to making sure that the rules aren't written by the 1%. The second thing is, one of the things that Angus emphasized in his talk was new antitrust laws. The antitrust laws have not kept up with the 21st century. There are lots of things that the new monopolists and monopsonists are doing that were not problems 100 years ago, and things like what are called preemptive mergers, where they buy young firms before they're large enough to be subject to scrutiny, and they don't ask how this is likely to affect competition in the future. In any case, there's a whole set of remedies to increase the bargaining power of workers and reduce the market power of firms. In the case of Korea, one of the things that is a source of market power of the chaebol is the cross-holdings of the different companies, which mean it was like the original trust issue in the United States that gave rise to our antitrust laws, where people with a relatively small fraction of the ownership can actually have control. And that concentrates control, and that really does give rise to market power. One of the positive aspects in the past of the chaebol were that they were mainly engaged in international trade. And the ability to exercise market power in international trade is much lower. The worst abuses occur in non-traded goods in domestic markets. And the concern is, of course, that the chaebol are moving more and more into domestic markets, and that large international companies like Google, are entering into local markets all over the world, not so much maybe in Korea, but these international companies come to Korea like Microsoft with market power. So one has to keep a view. If there is market power arising particularly from non-traded goods, one has to take a particularly strong position on of the dangers associated with that market power.
Well, I guess in Korea we have very serious, fair competition issue between the large Jebel company and the subcontractor, small and medium-sized subcontractor. These markets has virtually no competition. So the bargaining power belongs to the big Jebel company, and so because of that, there is no active innovation by the small and medium-sized company. That probably is another aspect of the non-tradable aspect you just mentioned.
Exactly, and it also represents the monopsony that Angus talked about in his talk, and that most of antitrust has been about monopoly power, not monopsony power. And we now understand that monopsony power in not only the labor market, but as you say, in the input market, can be very, very large, and is what gives a competitive advantage to Walmart, gives competitive advantage to a lot of firms around Amazon and so forth.